Welcome to the show, Devorah Heitner.
Thank you.
Yeah, good to see you. I'm glad you're here. Psyched to connect.
Likewise.
Yeah, here we are on Zoom. We're going to be talking about screens, and this is kind of our new normal. Yeah.
Live in the Zoom.
Yeah. Devorah, the listeners just heard your intro, but I'm curious, how do you introduce yourself if in a couple lines?
Sure. So I was a media scholar. I used to be a professor, and then I left that work to go and write my book Screenwise and just start talking to parents because I recognized when I became a parent, which was right around the time that social media became a really predominant force in our lives, that parents were just lost on this stuff. And a lot of them were very anxious and even using screen time to judge their parenting, but in a very negative way that wasn't really supporting their kids. So I started focusing on how we could mentor our kids rather than just monitor them and how we could look at screen time in a more nuanced and thoughtful way. And I've been doing that ever since. And lately I've been doing a lot of supporting school districts and individual school communities and parents on pandemic parenting
Yeah.
and just understanding the ways kids are using screens right now
hmm
so that maybe we'll feel less bad and panicked about it and actually be able to support our kids and meet them where they are.
Yeah, cool. And maybe also while understanding the risks of, if a kid's constantly on their phone, like what are the downsides? I think we could all guess, but I'd be curious about your professional opinion there. And how, if we rewind the tapes a little bit in your life, like how did you get into, I don't know, being a spokesperson on this and also caring about this kind of subject?
I mean, way back when I wrote a master's paper about the anti-racist curriculum of Sesame Street, and then I wrote my doctorate about something else in media studies, and that became a book called Black Power TV. And then I kept thinking about kids media because I was teaching college classes I taught a class called Kids Media Culture at DePaul and then at Lake Forest. And
Hmm.
my 18 to 20-year-old students would interview third graders, had them do this project where we'd interview third graders in an affluent school and a working class school. And they were blown away. They were like, oh, we had such good childhoods before all of this. And I was like, it's very weird to hear a 19-year-old talk about back in the day when they're talking about a 9-year-old, because that could be their, sibling. Like that's not even a full generation.
Right.
And so it made me think, okay, where something's going on. And then I became a parent in 2009, and a lot of my friends became parents around that time. And there were so many questions about should we share our babies' pictures on Facebook and
Totally.
what's the appropriate protocol here and when and then as smartphones proliferated, should we get kids phones at all? Should we get them smartphones? What's the age? So now, I mean, I teach a whole class on
Oh my
just
God.
getting kids a first phone and what you need to know as a parent, because it's so much about not just your kids' readiness, but your readiness to mentor them. You
Yeah.
definitely don't want to just throw that thing under the tree and, hope for the best.
Yeah, that's right. I want to start with a question that's, I don't know, an assumption here, which is an emerging assumption that I've heard over the years, and I just want to get your professional take on this, is kids, millennials and below, don't care about privacy. And so your point about, do I share my kid's phone on social media or my kids' pictures and stuff on social media? Uh, That's sort of an assumption I've heard over the years. The younger generation doesn't care. They're posting everything they want all the time on social media. And is that really true that they don't care?
They have a different understanding of privacy than previous generations. Like I'm a Gen Xer and I'm like, you want to know what books I took out of the library? Who's asking? I'm like,
Uh-huh.
that's none of your business.
Yeah.
But kids do care about privacy. They care about privacy from certain peers. They care about privacy from school. If they thought their teachers were looking at their Snapchat, they would find that very creepy. And that's the word they would use probably. If
hmm
they thought their parents were looking at their group texts or their social media from friends, they would find that very creepy and they would call it spying. So kids do care about privacy, but they define it a little bit differently. And they do sometimes forget who they're speaking to in these different audiences. So sometimes they think of themselves as speaking to a small group of friends, even though they're speaking in a relatively public app. And
Right.
they're kind of shocked when they realize, like, wait, grandma can see that, or, your school principal could be scrolling and see that hashtag, especially if hashtag your school. There might be someone who works at that school who's, scrolling social media
Exactly.
regularly looking for that. And so that's always kind of shocking to kids and jarring. And then I think both adults and kids are relatively clueless as I find the movie The Social Dilemma a little apocalyptic and makes people feel very bad and helpless in some ways. But I will say that's a wake-up call for everyone. I think a lot of adults and kids are really clueless about how our data is being used, or, are you talking to Alexa, or are you talking to someone who works there? Who's getting that? If you ask Siri, who knows what you asked Siri? So I think it's really important. And that could be anyone from, my 90-year-old mother-in-law who loves to ask Siri and Alexa to my almost 12-year-old kid. It's not just kids who are, I think, clueless about privacy, but specifically with their reputations. I think kids are very protective of their reputations and the sort of separation between school or work and, say, their personal lives in ways that actually then get collapsed when we're also searchable. And so, when if I was a kid in the 80s and I changed my name to go to college, nobody would be able to sort of check that out and look me up. And so I think kids are, in some sense, trying to find what we had, which was this ability to change our identities without that past record kind of catching us up and being there.
Yeah. Okay. That's cool. It's a cool way to think about it. I mean, in college, had someone been following me around, like had I had Snapchat or Instagram stories in college, or even Instagram, I'm kind of glad I didn't, because I was kind of a disaster in college. And there's just some behaviors that were like, I can't believe I did that type of thing, that might be perceived as, I don't know, really hurtful, reckless, whatever, but fun at the time. Right. And I'm curious how young people are doing now with, like, even college kids, like how these apps are being used, I guess, to hurt themselves or other people also,
Well, we're definitely seeing, there was a story at Ohio State where a girl went on kind of a tirade on a young woman, I should say, because she's a college student, so over 18, right? A young woman went on a tirade while intoxicated on Snapchat about her ex-boyfriend, and she was white, and the boyfriend is now dating an African-American woman. And so it was really racist and problematic. And as some other student that I talked to at that school said, she was booed out of school. Like, this became public and she was booed out of school, right? She had to leave and her parents were threatened. It really extended beyond even her own identity and her own reputation. And as painful as it is to think of someone being, saying something racist and hurtful, right? And words do harm, and words are impactful in the world, and we should be accountable for our words. And someone over 18 should know the meaning of those words. But at the same time, when you look at, okay, if she had had a drunken conversation with her two best friends and they were like, what are you talking about? That's not okay. And, and sobered up and kind of realized where things had gone in her mind, and maybe realized she had some personal work to do around her feelings and her white privilege and her white supremacist, maybe, kind of training and upbringing. And a lot of that is stuff you don't even know is there, right? It's unconscious until it sort of comes out of your mouth when you're drunk in that moment. And that's I don't want to say, oh, it's no big deal, that was okay. It's very, very problematic. At the same time, should her parents be getting bomb threats and, like threats on their lives? Like, is that an appropriate and proximate reaction? Or is this someone who really needs to maybe like take a class or do a workshop on anti-racism, really look at themselves, but should be able to move on with their lives? And how long do we want that to associate? Right. And so, I wrote about a similar case where a girl was 15. And I think, should we, if we lived in a country like in Europe, in the EU, where they have the right to be forgotten, the 15-year-old who had a similar experience, who used a racial slur, again, to use that example, but used it in a way that doesn't seem like it was even attempting to be derogatory toward a specific person, but she still used the word in a single Snapchat to a friend, and it was exposed 3 years later. And she lost her place in college and all of that. Like, this is a really complicated situation. And as someone who's spent years doing anti-racist work, I'm like, we don't want to tell white kids, it's fine, say whatever you want, but the message to a 15-year-old should be, you can still learn and do better. Right. You can still move forward. So it's not that we don't want to hold kids accountable, but what I've been trying to say to schools is we want to hold them accountable as much as possible in the moment and to the people that they've hurt in that moment, not take this out 3 years later and use it as a bludgeon against their future and say, you can never recover from this. Because actually, unfortunately, what I've learned from my research is that actually drives some people toward the extreme.
Mm-hmm.
If you can never be accepted in society again, you might then, I mean, the really scary thought would be, do you go toward an extremist hate group when you were never headed in that direction? I mean, I don't think that's what's going to happen with these two young women, but it can happen when someone's fully marginalized. Where do they go? What do they do? And so I think we need to cultivate a world where we're accountable for our actions, but also where there's some way of moving forward. And I like the right to be forgotten, honestly, the European law where people under 18, so that would mean like, if my 12-year-old goes out tomorrow and posts something really just dumb, or if kids make a video of themselves singing a song, like with lyrics making fun of a teacher at their school, say, very problematic, very harassing, but also like in the context of 12-year-olds could be like funny, could be a way to deal with the stress of middle school. It's only if it has a worldwide audience that it becomes a problem.
Yeah.
Right. So I think we just really need to look at what we're doing to kids with social media and this level of surveillance, and there's so many examples that, like you brought up, college behavior. I think if we added, misogynist or homophobic terms to the kind of you're blacklisted forever, that would be like a lot of college students.
Oh my God, it'd be huge. Yeah.
Right. That would be like, and so are we going to say like, there's no rehabilitating those kids? Because I taught 18-year-olds at DePaul and at Lake Forest, and a lot of them were pretty clueless when they got there, like I was when I was 18 and I moved to Chicago.
Oh yeah.
But they could learn. They came to college to learn.
Right. So you're saying like we don't want to shame people into oblivion and not have them learn and grow from the experience, right?
Exactly. And so social media is tricky because it puts you in a situation where your reputation is potentially at stake. And kids are aware of that. I just interviewed some 6th grade girls and they were like, yeah, you could be exposed, in all these different ways. And they have the sense that there are people out there like trying to find you, kind of whatever, picking your nose in a Zoom class or something and like showing that video to the world. I mean, and I think it's really important that we don't want our kids to feel like the world is this kind of dangerous place. And we want to have the conversation be about character. You're a good person. You don't use racial slurs. You don't use misogynist terms. You don't talk in a mean way about a teacher because you're a good person, not because you don't want to get caught. I think the problem with giving kids the message of like, I don't want to get caught is also then you never have the conversation about character. And then they're like, oh, well, then I'll just make a Finsta. It'll be my underground Insta. I'll do all my mean, shady, uncool or quasi illegal or whatever stuff there. If that's the message. And I think parents get so scared of their kids being publicly known for doing either dumb stuff or problematic stuff or offensive stuff that they're like, go be secretive, change your name on social media. And it's like, no, let's be your authentic self, but think about how other people feel. If you say this mean thing about, your teacher or a kid at your school, like, remember there's another human being on the other end of the screen. And I think so many of us forget that when we're making a comment on social media, when we're commenting anonymously on something we read. If you read the comments section, like the first few times I published in national press years ago, my husband, who's a journalist, was like, oh, don't read the comments, Devorah. And I was like, I'm writing about kids and tech. I'm not that political. This isn't like red versus blue. Like, who's going to troll me? And I got on there and there were people like, saying really horrible things. Not everyone. Most comments were actually very relevant and helpful. And this is why I don't want to not read them, because sometimes you get a comment like, I'm a 13-year-old kid and everything you just said about 13-year-olds on Instagram is really true. Or you missed the mark here. Here's this other insight. Like, I want to see that. But then there are the people who are like, well, I don't have a kid and I've never met a kid, but you're wrong about everything, and you're like, okay, you just took the time to write that to me. You put your energy into that communication. What did that give back to you? And I think that's a question we want to ask kids. Like, one of the things I tell kids is if you're hitting the keyboard hard, like, what's going on? Maybe stop for a second.
Yeah. Seriously, take a breath. I want to take a bit of a U-turn here and come back to just screens in general and children and parents. And this privacy conversation is crucial, I think, also. If we back it up, though, and talk about just screens and kids, I'd love to talk about this because we have 2 kids. We're a pretty screen-free family. That's our choice. Doesn't mean it's right? It's just our values. And screens are our life. Like they see dad on his screen all the time, right? Because I run an online business. And at a certain point, they're going to get more and more access to screens and get their own computer. And that's just life. That's the world we live in. And what are some of the basics here with how old, what is age appropriate giving kids phones in general and access to screens? Like when I walk through the airport, I see kids of every age on screens, every single
Right.
age, and they're on screens the whole time. No one is interacting in the family, and I'm over here going, being relationally oriented. I'm a little get a little judgy, right? And I'm like, is that really the best how we can do it here, like in a family? So give us some of the
Yeah.
basics
I mean,
here.
I think the airport is a place where it demands so much compliance and sitting from kids. That's a place where even a relatively light screen family might go heavy on screens because your kid has to stay in one place.
Right.
You're sort of trapped there for an inordinate amount of time. And some kids really struggle with that. And we know that other people can be really judgmental of families if their kid is melting down or having a hard time. So I
Right.
think specifically flying and the airport is a place, remember that, right? I wish I was flying again. I miss it.
Yeah.
But I think if you remember how families might have looked at you if your 3-year-old was struggling on the plane, you can understand why someone might be like, I'm giving them an iPad so I can avoid that judgment.
Totally.
Whereas much of the time it's the opposite. If your kid was on the iPad at the playground, the judgment would be what kind of moms and dads are you because your kid is on a screen in this place where they could be doing other things. So I think we need to, first of all, pull back from judging in some ways other families and their relationship to tech as much as we can. I mean, certainly we can be worried and concerned about it, but we don't know what's going on often. I mean, there are things you might hear from your kids' peers where you're going to be like, whoa, I can't believe you're doing that. It's really crucial that we look at the role of specific kinds of tech experiences. So is there a show your child really loves on television? Is there an app they really love on the tablet? Is there a game that they're playing with their friends right now? Like maybe, Among Us or Fortnite or have been really popular, really interactive spaces or Minecraft during the pandemic, especially, but just in general, ways for kids to spend a lot of time together. Some of them are kind of creative spaces, collaborative spaces. Are kids using social media? When kids ask for tech, what are they asking for? Do they want to be entertained? Do they want to connect with a friend?
Hmm.
Do they want to put their own stuff, their own creative work out in the world? Those are 3 examples of very different ways of using tech. And it's important to understand what our kids are hoping to do, what they're learning. My son early in the pandemic taught himself Scratch, which is this kid's kind of programming language, like an introductory
Yeah.
programming language from the folks at MIT. It was really easy to learn. And then he found a Scratch game that was based on a book series he liked. And then he turned his friends onto it. And, for me, that's really thoughtful and interesting. And
Yeah.
he also started asking really interesting questions about copyright. Like, is it okay to make a game based on a book series? And what are the rules? And what if he wanted to adapt the game? Like intellectual property? To me, that's for an 11-year-old, like some really interesting stuff.
For sure.
That said, we don't want our kids spending all their time, watching unboxing videos on YouTube and whining for the toys that they see. We certainly don't want them watching stuff that's too violent or pornographic. We don't want them to be passive all the time when they're doing tech. We want them to be active, engaged, and creative. So I would look at, creation versus consumption, social versus solo use. Those are some of the questions I'm curious about with kids. And then also, what is your family culture around technology? Do they need to ask mom or dad before downloading a new app? Is that a family shared device that they have to check out? Or is it their own device? Even if it's their own device and it's sort of all theirs, can it maybe live overnight somewhere else, not in their bedroom? Because most children don't need a connected device and won't benefit from a connected device in their bedroom overnight.
Yeah.
So these are some things families can look at. And then if there's conflicts around screens, like look at what those conflicts are actually about. Are they about content? Are they about time, distraction?
Hmm.
Is it about behavior that you see after the use of screens?
Right.
And what does that look like? So I think parents need to get really curious. I think when we lump every kind of technological experience our kids are having into screen time, we're really not, it's not really helpful.
Uh-huh. I see what you're
Right.
saying. Yeah. Yeah, totally. Okay. And can we talk about when, like my experience being a relationship educator and someone who's very sensitive to relational dynamics and the nervous system and how we deal with our own activation. What I see a lot of people do is we as a culture struggle to be with our own experience. We get upset and we go to our phones. We get upset and we go work. We get upset and we do anything but be with our experience. And my sort of bias here is it's dangerous to have children training themselves at a very young age to go to a phone or a device when they're upset, because it can be a resource, but it's also like then a kid never learns how to be with their experience, right? And I think it's a vital life skill. So can you talk about that? And I might be missing the mark here,
Yeah.
but that's just a.
I think boredom is also really important. That we know that creativity comes from boredom. We know that kids need to be bored and come up with their own fun. That said, I have a singleton, right? So he doesn't have other kids living in the house, and he hasn't been in school for a year.
Right.
We're getting to a year. We're 4 weeks short of a year that he was sent home with all his stuff from fifth grade. At what point do I say enough boredom, right? Yes, boredom is productive, but there's a certain amount of boredom that leads to kind of ennui and sadness that we wouldn't wish on anyone, right? We can say, oh, Nelson Mandela was really creative in prison, but I think most of us don't want to go to prison. We don't want that kind of character building. And I think we don't want our kids, yes, we want our kids to be resilient and go through hard things. And we're all going through some hard things right now. But at a certain point, if they have a show that they love or a game that they like to play with their friends, and that's giving them something to look forward to every week in this time when there's maybe less to look forward to than usual, and this time that we don't know if we're going back to camp, we don't know when we're going to travel and see grandparents again. I like that predictability and that appointment and that looking forward to. What we don't want is the rabbit hole. We don't want the kids to just, that's their only experience, that they're binging the entire season of a show in a 2-day period and they, don't come up for air.
And they get mad when you ask them to stop.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And I think it's also important for kids to problem solve in their peer relationships and other relationships in person when possible. So when it's not a pandemic, if you are in a conflict with a friend, you're much more likely to be able to work that out in person. And kids get that text messaging is very tough in terms of relationships. They understand. I've asked a bunch of middle grades and middle school kids when I'm out at schools, hey, do you find it's a little easier to get in a fight with somebody on text versus in person? And they're like, oh yeah. And they're like anything from spelling errors and autocorrect leading to misunderstandings and sending to the wrong person. So like actual sort of user technical error to it's just, you don't have the facial expression and the tone.
Yeah.
You don't have the person in front of you to read how they're doing before you're speaking to them. Whereas even in my marriage, if I don't get into tons of big fights with my husband, but texting is much more likely to sound snippy to one of us or to lead to a misunderstanding. Whereas I can walk into a room and see he's stressed, he's up to here. This is not the time to say, hey, how about, or to introduce a new idea or a new request or a new demand into the conversation of the relationship. Whereas on text, I have no idea what he's doing. I have some sense that he's home dealing with remote school and work, and I'm potentially interrupting if I write to him. I know that. But it's really tough to meet someone where they are. And I think for kids, they're new at friendship skills and conflict. They're new at figuring out that assertiveness versus standing up for yourself versus being mean. Sometimes kids are too doormatty because they don't know how to stand up for themselves in their relationships. And then they save it all for a text and they're, typing it out but really they would have done better to maybe stick up for themselves verbally weeks ago. And so there's a lot going on with texting with kids. And I always would say it's better to work it out in person. And also a lot of times kids are group texting and it's better to work it out one-to-one.
Yeah.
But right now kids don't have that. So at least a face call is still better than a texting for working out a problem. Because what I say to kids is it's easy to get into a fight with a text. It's really hard to get out of one. If you've tried to take a conflict all the way to resolution via text.
Yeah, I haven't seen it happen, I don't think.
Yeah, it's tough. I mean, that's when I'm always okay, let's get on the phone, even in a work situation that's getting tense or tricky where I'm always please call me, because I just feel I know we can work it out, but the texting is not getting us there. And as an adult, the second you find yourself typing into an email, as I said in my previous email, get on the phone. Something's not working in the communication.
Yeah, I'm with you. I have a rule, never fight over text. And I think it's, never's a strong word, but, there might be these snags that we have. But in general, it's just a good practice to go face to face whenever we can.
Yeah, and kids need to understand that, but kids will say that's so awkward. And that's where they do want to hide behind that phone. And we have to tell them the most important conversations are awkward. I mean, I asked a group of 6th graders, at a little adorable school on a farm in Indiana, what are some questions that you should only, like, what are some things you should only talk about in person or you should not text about? And they were like, well, if somebody dies, and again, this is like pre-pandemic. So we're imagining a world where we can like at least make a call or show up if somebody dies. And then one kid said, asking someone to marry you. And I was just like, I love it. Like as much as we think the Jumbotron is so funny, like that is probably an in-person conversation for most couples.
Yeah, absolutely. Hey, quick interruption from yours truly. What's up? Guys, please come to my latest training, relationshipschool.com/training. We often talk about how to own our needs, how to communicate better, how to listen better, how to deal with, your family of origin, how to deal with other difficult people, how to deal with you and yourself because you're difficult sometimes. And we also cover how to help other people. How do we help people work through their relationship challenges? Come to this training and find out and ask me a question live. relationshipschool.com/training. All right, we'll see you there. Back to the podcast. I'm curious what you know about and what's research is being done on screen use in kids and the brain.
There is some really good research. I know the Children's Center in Seattle is doing some good stuff, and Harvard, there's a Center for Children in Media, and then also the Fred Rogers Center in Pittsburgh. So those are all places where there's some research happening. There may be a ton of other folks doing that. I mean, I'm more of a culture person than a brain person, but I'm always really sensitive to when mental health declines are attributed to screens. And there's a lot of correlation that people have cited there. And some pretty well-known studies have cited that correlation. But the causation gets a little trickier because we also see kids actually using social media to buoy one another and support one another. And there's a real chicken or egg question when you see a kid who's struggling, spend a lot of time online. Is it that they're struggling and then they're trying to escape there? Or is the time online reinforcing something negative? So I think it's a really tricky place. And I also think it's very important to understand that we're in a place in 2021, thankfully, of greater understanding of mental health than we've ever had. And so I think you and I might be around the same age. If we think about high school, which for me was like started in 89 and went to the early 90s, right? So like I'm in high school at that point, and I think about the number of my peers who were self-medicating with cigarettes, with alcohol, with recreational and illegal drugs, borrowed prescription drugs. I don't even know, like all the things that kids were using to self-medicate. And I'm not saying that's not a problem anymore, but none of those kids were taken to therapy. None of those kids were offered the opportunity of mental health support. That was almost never. I had one friend who went inside the hospital, like had, a more serious mental health episode and did, receive mental health care in a hospital setting. But even that was really unusual. And the fact that more kids are getting support for their mental health now, I don't believe that necessarily means more kids are in crisis. I think we're looking at adolescents in a different way and supporting more kids. Mm-hmm. Because there was a smoking lounge in my high school. So I'm telling you that like something was different then. We gave kids this latitude to deal with their anxiety maybe in a different way.
Yeah. So right. That's a good.
I just think the idea that mental health problems are sort of skyrocketing among kids. We have to look at, are we identifying and supporting better? And that would increase the numbers of kids who are an identified patient. And is there anything else they could be concerned about? I mean, let's look at the events of just the last few weeks in our country. Like, is it for sure among us that's getting your kid down? Or could it be that we're in a really divided society where people are talking to each other in incredibly cruel ways? Your kid may be part of an identity category that's been really threatened and talked about in a way that's horrifying. Right. Your kid may not have seen another peer in a year. So it's not clear to me for sure that it's like social media. If your kid is struggling, and they may be, and I feel it, I see it. Yeah. Around the country in these schools I'm talking to, but I don't know if it's the video games that's making the kid, or the social media. It might be. Well, if you're the kid whose family is hardcore quarantining and you're seeing on social media families that aren't and having slumber parties and you feel left out, it might be contributing to your depression. Yeah. It's a really valid point. I mean, we don't really know, is kind of what you're saying, is we don't really know what else is going on in the home and in their lives, right? In terms of, I could be in a household that's really, parents just lost their job, it's really stressed out.
maybe there's some aggression at home or some silence that's extremely stressful. And so I go to my phone because I have friends there and I get relief, and it actually feels better than being in the home, right?
Yeah, I think it's really important. And Dana Boyd said this, teenagers aren't addicted to their phones, they're addicted to their friends. And I think that's really just an important thing to remember. That said, if you see a kid who abandons self-care, who doesn't shower, who plays video games around the clock, for example, or, has other signs that you're concerned that, looks like it might be an addiction. And I'm not a psychologist, so I would be very clear with the family, like I can't diagnose them,
Sure.
but definitely get a mental health eval. Definitely go to someone who can tell you. And even if it's not an addiction, if it's disrupting your life or your family, then it needs to change, right?
Yeah.
So even if it doesn't meet a clinical criteria for an addiction, if it's problematic and disruptive, then something has to shift. And whether that's, some parents are really attracted to cold turkey. I'm just taking the Xbox and putting it in the trunk of my car, whether it's making a contract, right? What does that look like? That's going to vary between families. It's going to look different in different parenting styles. It'll look different in different ages of young people. But
Yeah.
it's really important that we don't leap to the conclusion that that's the cause. There's usually other things going on. I mean, a lot of families come to try to talk to me after my talks about screen time to say that they're really in a crisis about screens. And it's very rarely just about screens.
There's other family dynamics going on.
Yeah,
right?
just stuff with their kid, maybe in the world, happening, maybe bullying, maybe something else. It's important to really suss all that out. And it's hard because parents see the kids with the phone and they feel alienated, and they also feel left out. And then they want to spy and kind of intrude on that space and see what their kids are texting. And I think that's a really be careful what you wish for. Do you want to be inside of your teenager's head? What if your teenager says today, I hate my mom? Well, I said I hate my mom to my best friend when I was 13, walking home from school one day. And it was kind of like, I felt like the world was going to explode because I just said this thing out loud. But at the same time, I needed to say it to work through the feelings I was having and the conflicts we were having. And my friend was feeling, a lot of similar stuff, and we were able to talk about it. Is it helpful for that kid's mom to read what she says? I'm not sure.
Exactly. Yeah. And the next day you probably liked your mom, right?
Exactly. So I think it's really important for parents who to do that. First of all, I would disclose to your kids that you're doing it and that you're doing it to keep them safe. I wouldn't try to go all NSA on your kids unless there's something really, really concerning going on and you can't get any answers. But that wouldn't be my first step or second step or third step. But I also think be careful what you wish for, because do you want to relive middle school? Do you want to see the language that the best friend uses that is so nice when he comes to your house? Do you want to see him, dropping F-bombs in the text chain? Maybe you'd rather just have the impression you have of the kid who's like really lovely when they come to your house.
Totally. NSA, that's no screens allowed.
Oh, NSA.
You
So
sort of
like don't
drop
go
that
all
really
NSA on your kids, like national
stuff.
security, like
Oh.
spying without them knowing, covert spying.
Oh, that's funny. I interpreted it as no screens allowed.
Yeah. No, I was thinking, being like spying without them knowing, because then you also paint yourself in a corner. Like, say you give your kid a new phone and you say, hey, you know what? I've got this thing on my phone. I can read your texts, but I'm going to take it away after 6 months if I see you using it responsibly. And then you just come to me if you've got an issue. That's a very different conversation than covertly monitoring, where you're seeing all your kids' stuff. You feel really omnipotent because you think you know everything going on with your kid, but you could be still missing things. Much more important to observe. And I think as a relationship person, I mean, you're kind of on the same page, like observe your child, because your kid could be literally upstairs, crying in their bedroom over something that someone said that the app wouldn't pick up, like that, the bullying spy app, for example. If someone says to your kid, nice shoes, and she's upstairs crying in her room, because we all know that someone can say nice shoes and be throwing a lot of shade, right?
Yeah.
But the app isn't going to pick up nice shoes and tell you, oh, mommy, somebody said nice shoes to your kid today.
Right.
But so it's much more important that you observe, like, does your kid have somebody to sit with at lunch? Are they coming home upset? Are they eating? Are they sleeping? Do they seem excited about something in the future?
Yeah. These kind of basic kind of wellness, observations.
That's going to give you a lot more information than reading their texts, which is going to be filled with like weird little friend references and whatever they're trying to talk about.
So I have to ask, you may get this question, is there an age where it's appropriate to give a kid a phone?
I would say it's more like a level of responsibility that they have, and also a level of quote unquote need. Now, obviously, none of us need a smartphone, right? I lived well into adulthood without one,
Yeah.
but it would be very hard for me to run my online business and do the traveling I do. I think about, I go to strange cities when it's not a pandemic and drive to places, and I love having the Google lady tell me where to go and when to get off the highway. So it's a huge convenience and helps me live my life. I think for kids, a lot of the milestones during lockdown are a little different. So I would say a milestone would be kids who can take public transit or walk or bike somewhere independently in your town. Can they get from point A to point B without you? Can they go to the public library on their own? Can they do anything on their own? Can they make their own lunch? Can they get their homework done without you kind of hovering? Can they get out the door in the morning with, their backpack packed, or are you doing it for them? So just these indications of independence, which suggest that they should start to take over their own plans with friends.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, when you are running your kid's social life, and I, as mom, am mostly running my kid's social life in the sense of like, I probably connected more with the friend's parents. My husband and I do a lot of very, I would say, involved co-parenting, but I'm still the person who's more likely to have a friend's parent number in my phone than he is.
For sure.
Right. So just looking at how labor gets split, in families, like that's a job. And in my case, it's mostly been my job.
Yeah.
So I might have like this person's dad, this person's mom in my phone. At what point is it not really appropriate for me to be making plans for my kid?
Yeah.
Is it more appropriate for him to be saying, do you want to hang out after soccer, or to be putting something on the calendar? And we're living right in the middle of that. And the pandemic has tremendously interrupted the progress that I'd hoped to mentor. Like right before the pandemic, my son went to the movies with friends for the first time without an adult. And I was like, yes, right? And actually one of his friends literally pumped his fist in the air. This little boy, it was so sweet, and said, I feel like I'm in high school, like after I walked away, because I dropped them off. I mean, this wasn't like they didn't get there on their own or anything, but I dropped them off at the Star Wars movie, and they went in on their own and, paid for the tickets and got their own massive popcorn. And it was just such a moment. And like, I'm so mad that these moments are being stolen from our kids right now. Like that, this is not happening. They're not out there independently having these experiences, including like things going wrong, like, and having to troubleshoot and problem solve. But a phone starts to become important when it's time for them to start making their own plans, and at least texting. Now, to go to a smartphone, which also has search and also has social media, might be next level. So maybe you just want your kid initially just texting, and then that next level, which they could even do with a watch in some cases. And then that next level would be, are they ready to have something that's a more robust device? And that could be, when they're doing even more independently, maybe they're babysitting and they need to keep a calendar on their phone or something. I mean, I know if I hire a teenage sitter and I tell them the next time I want to see them and I don't see them get out something to write it down, like a phone, I'm kind of like, are you coming back? Or,
Right.
So I want to see those independent skills. And that's certainly by high school. I know a lot of parents are really into like wait until eighth. For a smartphone. I'm really agnostic that eighth grade is the pinnacle of judgment. I mean, I've met fifth graders that have better judgment than eighth graders. So it depends on you. It also depends if your kid is very reactive when things go wrong in situations. That might be a kid where maybe they should only have access to a phone for a short time after school to text and make plans with friends, but you may not want them on that group text where things are blowing up.
I mean, another plug I want to make here for just social skills, like how are their social skills?
Exactly. So that reactivity, can they apologize and own up when they mess up? Do they know not to text someone again and again when they can't reach them? Right. All those kinds of little things. And some of that, again, I think parents do need to expect a certain amount of error and kind of walking into walls in those early years. And it's really important for parents not to feel like they've failed when that happens. So if your kid does text somebody again and again, and then the friend texts back like, hey, you're annoying me, bud. Like some of that is that early kind of awkward social stuff. You can help your kids with it. You can prevent some stuff by reminding them the right choices and etiquette. But this is not a situation where your kid's messed up and that means you failed.
Yeah, right.
Every middle schooler is going to mess up in their digital lives a few times. They're going to forward something they shouldn't. They're going to go to a website they shouldn't. And we need to look at that as learning experience and not as some kind of like parental stain of like, what have I done wrong? You have to remember yourself in middle school.
Yeah.
Right. And think about how awkward you were.
Yeah.
So like, if you like somebody, what do you do? Well, you could leave a note in their locker. You could play ding dong ditch, but like, are you going to do like the cool, like mature thing that like a 30-year-old would do? Probably not.
Right. Yeah. Cool. Devorah, as we wind down, what I guess, yeah, there's more questions here. And I'm curious, like in your book that you wrote a couple of years ago, and then we can talk if you want about your book coming out later in a year or so. Is there like a kind of definitive guide? Are some of these resources in there if someone wants to go further?
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff in there about being a tech positive parent, what that looks like, dealing with school, dealing with friendships, dealing with even your own desire to share about your kid. One of the big important things I say in there is, ask your kid before you share about them, even news about them or pictures of them, because that respects their boundaries and their personhood. And starting that practice of asking establishes a boundary of consent that then they will model with their own friends. And there's actually research that supports this, that if your child has grown up with you saying, oh, I took a picture of you at soccer today, is it okay if I post it? And if your child has full veto power to say yes or no, that's really great for them, because when they start taking pictures of their friends, they'll know to ask before they share.
At
And they'll know
what
it's okay
age?
to tell someone, hey, don't share that.
Well, is there an age that comes online where that kind of conversation? Because you're not going to ask a 3-year-old, "Can I share?"
Yeah, I would say like by the time kids are either 7, 8, 9, like by the time they have some sense of sort of public versus private. And sometimes, kids will ask you, well, who's on your Facebook, mom? Or who's on your Instagram, dad? And that's a valid question.
Hmm.
My kid often doesn't want me to share things on social, like to the point where you might look at my social and be like, do you have a kid? But I'm allowed to share with a small group, which is like a group text, which is me and my husband and his mother and my parents, and that might be okay. Like my kid. And one of the things I learned talking not just with my own kid, but other families, is that kids were self-inhibiting their goofy, sweet, adorable behavior because they didn't want it to be shared with their peers.
Hmm.
And it makes sense. You might be dancing around in your PJs at home and sing a silly song and feel great about life at 9 or 10, but that's not what you want your 5th grade friends to see. And your parents might be friends with their parents on social media. And I think the
Yeah.
last thing any of us as parents want is our kids to prematurely self-inhibit their sort of awesome kid lovingness, whether it's being affectionate with siblings or being silly, right? None of
Yeah.
us want our kids to sort of not feel safe doing that at home. And so home has to be a sanctuary where I'm not thinking, wow, my followers will really love that, but that's my child. That's a person,
Yeah. Totally.
and he might have a very different feeling about other kids seeing that versus the family.
What do you? I'm just curious if you saw the viral video of the dad sitting there with the tantruming child, the baby that was the dad was very calm, and the baby kept clinging on him. And did you see that video?
I didn't see that one, but I've seen a lot of videos of parents showing what their kids are doing, either like, this is why my kid is crying, kind of like exasperated, like the parents are exasperated and they're kind of wanting to get sympathy, I think, by showing what or even intentionally trying to shame older kids out of negative behaviors.
Hmm.
Um, all of that is not good. I mean, I think anything that you think, if you have any question about whether your kid will benefit or want this to be out in the world, the answer should always be no. Because you can't
Yeah.
take it back, right? If your kid goes viral in a video with you,
Hmm.
you can't
Well,
take it back.
it's interesting. Yeah. I mean, it's an interesting quandary. I feel for the dad because as a fellow father and having been in that moment, right, it so spoke to me of the 1-year-old or whatever just freaking out and just breathing through it, right? There was like a moment of like connection, but what I'm thinking of right now is that kid in 10 years or 15 years going to be okay with that video?
And it partly
That's
also depends on who they are and with what intentions it was posted. I mean, I certainly think that a lot of us have shared, intimate family moments with positive intentions. And even if our kids don't love it, they get that the intention was positive. And I've had even
yeah.
like high school and college students who are already starting to see their parents more as people and understand their parents, lovingly, but with flaws, right? Like, so, a 20-year-old might be able to see like, oh yeah, like my mom, she always posts everything on Facebook and kind of drives me nuts, but she loves me, you know what I mean?
Uh-huh.
Or whatever. And so I think that obviously the most harmful would be where it's done with the attempt to shame, right? The actual
For
where,
sure.
where the parents are
Making fun of or
using
something.
using sharing as child abuse, which is which is what's happening when we're intentionally shaming a child,
Hmm.
and sharing that. But I do think what we want is for our kids to feel safe. And kids don't feel safe if they think they could be sort of exposed to the
Exploited.
public,
Yeah. Yeah.
and that sense of safety, even for parents who have good intentions, I've had parents come back and say, I started asking my kids and they said it made them feel less stressed, knowing that they would be asked, knowing that I would never share without asking.
That's cool. Yeah. Yeah, that's great. Okay, Devorah, where can people find you?
So I'm at raisingdigitalnatives.com is my website. And I'm at Twitter at Devorah Heitner. And I always welcome people to engage in these spaces, whether it's Twitter or, email me. And I'm also out in the world at schools a lot right now by Zoom, but also in person someday again, I hope.
Yeah.
I've spent a lot of time in Colorado in the past.
Right on.
I hope to get back there.
Yeah. Look me up when you're here. Your last book was Screenwise, Helping Kids Thrive in Their Digital World.
Yeah.
Yeah, very cool. It's a lot of what we were talking about today. And then you have a future book coming out in a year or two?
Yeah, I'm working on a book about what it feels like to grow up in public. What is it like to have grown up with a digital record of, parents sharing about you, school potentially posting you, and then a digital record that you yourself created. And so one of the possible titles in my brain when I started was, This Will Go on Your Permanent Record. I don't think we're going to use that one, but that was the kind of impression I had of, this feeling that, and it's a lot for parents and kids to navigate. And I really want to help parents and kids focus more on character than the idea of the threat of consequences and thinking about how we present to the public world.
Yeah, love that. Remember character. Cool. Last question that I ask all our guests here at the Relationship School. If one of our missions is to reach 1 million young kids and help them get better at working through their relational challenges with themselves and other people. And if I had a room full of 1,000 teens and young adults, and I could only share with them one thing about relationships, and you were whispering in my ear, what would you want me to tell them?
When you're using tech to communicate with other people, remember there's always another person or a group of people on the other end of that communication. And so try to picture them, not the device that you're typing into, right? Remember there's another human being on the other end of that communication experience.
Yeah, good reminder. Thank you. Well, Devorah, thanks. I appreciate what you're up to in the world. Thanks for educating us today about screens and kids.
Thank you so much. It's been my pleasure.
Okay, cool. Go check out Devorah's work at raisingdigitalnatives.com. All right, and she's got a lot of good resources if this conversation is of interest to you. And I think my take here, guys, is screens can get in the way of connection. And I have a rule, never fight over text or email. And I don't know, I encourage you to adopt that rule. So that's one of your action steps, is to try on that rule for a month. Do not fight over text or email. And the way I did an Instagram post on this, and I gave you the actual things you can say on a text thread to someone wanting to get into it with you. And it's things like saying, hey, can we please take this to Zoom or FaceTime? I'd rather see you in your face and have you see my face if we're going to have this conversation. I think it will help us. Okay, that's you looking out for the relationship. Nice. If you're a parent, your action step is to talk with your co-parent, whether you're with them or not. And if you're just a single parent and your other parent's not even involved, to have a conversation with yourself and get clear. What is my boundary here? And do I have the support I need to hold it? And she had some really nice ways to talk about it in terms of consequences versus, I don't know, I just like the way she talked about it. So rewind that part, make sure you grok that. All right, if you're intrigued about how she framed that. Okay, come hang out with us in one of our trainings, relationshipschool.com/training. And you can come ask me a question, meet me live, etc. I'm going to be doing regular trainings, virtually, of course. We're looking to do an in-person event, maybe end of year, certainly 2022. Yes. Rooting for that day. Until then, have a beautiful day, morning, evening, and we'll talk soon. Hey, thanks so much for listening. Please subscribe to this YouTube channel. Share one of these videos with a friend. We want to help the planet get their act together around relationships, and you are one of them, so thank you.